Hello, my name is Benny, and together with Becca Mayville and David Huvivian, we will now explore the usage of antibiotics in meat production. To give you all an overlook of our presentation, we will first dig into the reasons why the use of antibiotics even started, and how it developed into what we see today. Second, we will bring up some of the current issues and benefits of the use of antibiotics in meat production. And third, we will explore some of the future options that we feel could resolve some of these issues while still keep the benefits that are related to this topic. Let's jump into it, shall we? Overall, the use of antibiotics in farm animals began as a way to aid animals who developed diseases before it spread to the rest of the herd, and therefore as a way to keep their meat disease-free so that distribution was still possible. So, the initial purpose is actually not based on profit maximizing, as we see today, although business was certainly in mind, but the health of consumers and animals was the number one concern. We can also look at this as an initial ex post mentality. However, with the use of antibiotics eventually developed into all-purpose use to 1. Prevent diseases from even developing in the first place, to stimulate the economic growth, and 3. As a sub-therapeutic function. Therefore, we can see it as a shift to ex-ante mentality growing from its initial purpose and usage. Antibiotic use in meat production became generalized as farmers changed their mindset from curative to proactive. Instead of just healing the sick cattle, they figured that they would just eliminate the presence of diseases from even developing, while also using it as a fertilizer. As the use of antibiotics became generalized, it took on a life of its own, much like the GMOs. The usefulness of scientifically tampering with the production of meat turned economical, as faster, larger, and more reliable production became possible. Therefore, economies of scales. This development further evolved as the response to an increasing rate of population growth, much like GMOs, was in need, and therefore an increase in demand followed the increase in supply for food. This is why farmers now need to have a more reliable and larger output, while also keeping their total and marginal costs down. One way for this to succeed was to make sure that animals was disease-free from the start and in optimal shape for further distribution, with little to no room for error possible. But this increasing rate of usage has resulted in unintended consequences. It has been proven that the presence of antibiotics in meat, and especially at the increasingly high rate that we see today, can cause damage to the health of its consumers. Looking at this illustration, we see how the cycle works. Another side effect is that some animals over time have developed a resistance to some of these antibiotics. This is a big issue as the antibiotics will still be prominent in the animal, therefore the meat, but have little to no effect on Another side effect is that some animals over time have developed a resistance to some of these antibiotics. This is a huge issue as the antibiotics will still be prominent in the animal, and therefore in the meat as well, but have little to no effect on the actual development of diseases. Additionally, this excessive use of antibiotics has affected the possibility of the ex post use as well, therefore working against its initial purpose in more ways than one. Here's another illustration of how the superbugs from farm to fork works. Now with this in mind, David will go over some of the issues of antibiotic use in meat production today, and how that has changed how we view meat production in general. We will also talk about how this change in views have diminished the possible benefits of initial purpose of antibiotic use in meat production versus no use at all.
My name is David Hovivian, and I'll be discussing the issue of antibiotic use in animals and the debate surrounding them. So let's jump right in. In this podcast, I'd like to highlight a few main points. First and foremost is an excess of gray area surrounding the issue. There are many scientists participating in this debate who have questionable ties to lobbying groups, creating a massive amount of conflicting information and causing confusion to the general public. It's also crucial to the understanding of this topic to know the primary companies, individuals, and organizations involved with the debate. Understanding who is involved and how they are connected will help us to entangle this vast web of political interests and how they relate to the economy, the environment, and public interest. Given the lack of concrete information, combined with shady dealings amongst both sides, I would argue that we should approach the future of antibiotic use very candidly. There's far more benefit to spending money to research the effects of antibiotics on the meat we consume than allowing the industry to continue taking shortcuts without acknowledging the risks involved. There are many lobbyists, both for and against the concept of using antibiotics to bolster the weight of livestock. Some of the more notable pro-lobbyists include the National Chicken Council, the Animal Health Institute, and Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Pro-lobbyists argue that the costs involved with removing antibiotics from feed would cripple the meat industry, causing massive cost increase for the consumers and be ineffective in reducing the spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Some of the more notable anti-lobbyists include the World Health Organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. Anti-lobbyists are concerned that the lack of information supporting the meat industry's claims and the research that supports their point of view, even if it's only preliminary. Put simply, the pros of removing subtherapeutic antibiotics or antibiotics used to increase yield rather than treat illness include a possible reduction in treatment-resistant bacterial infections, a decreased necessity for antibiotics to treat infections, and possibly safer meat for consumption. Cons include increased prices in meat, stress on the meat industry, and allegedly less safety regarding the consumption of meat and poultry. As stated previously, the most difficult problem surrounding this debate is misinformation. It's extremely difficult to determine if any of the research being done is truly unbiased, and it's even more difficult to gain accurate numbers for research purposes. According to an overview done by PBS, the meat industry doesn't publicize its use of antibiotics, so accurate information on the amount of antibiotics given to feed animals is hard to come by. The lack of information causes scientists to resort to estimations rather than concrete reports. The meat industry then cites these estimations as inconclusive, but refuses to produce the information necessary to make these reports accurate. Bayer's stance is actually, until more proof is found of the specific danger to humans, they will not withdraw their product from the chicken market. This, however, is only one scope of the problem. Another key issue with this debate is the influence of both sides. The current time period is one in which consumers are extremely weary of what goes into their food, and this creates an interesting paradox where the pro-lobbyists have more political support and the anti-lobbyists have the popular support. The future is open to individual speculation. So with that, I present Becca Mayville, who will be sharing her perspective on the future of this issue.
Hello everyone, my name is Becca Mayville, and I will be reframing the issue of antibiotic meat in terms of the future and how we should be dealing with it moving forward. We have several options. We could continue with the status quo and allow farmers to use antibiotics as growth agents, cut out antibiotics completely, or find a way to regulate antibiotic use to therapeutic use only, which is to say only giving antibiotics to animals who are sick or at high risk of becoming sick. People are worried, not without reason, about the use of antibiotics in livestock. The biggest worry is that excessive use of antibiotics in animals will breed antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which could infect humans. Bacteria like Salmonella, in some instances, can survive in the meat after the animal is slaughtered and processed, thus infecting those who consume it. So what are our options? Many people are advocating for antibiotic-free meat. Buying antibiotic-free meat is a growing trend, along with other GMO foods. However, if antibiotics were to be removed completely from agriculture, prices for meat would skyrocket. Very few consumers would be okay with that. Most people would agree that the use of antibiotics in treating sick animals is acceptable. However, the problem comes when farmers and ranchers use antibiotics as a substitute for good living conditions for their animals. Instead of making sure that their livestock have clean stalls, pure water, and are overall hygienic, some farmers pump their animals full of antibiotics to prevent and/or treat any illnesses caused by poor conditions. This is a way to keep their animals at the weights they want them for meat production without spending the money to ensure they are properly looked after. The potential consequences for subtherapeutic use, as it is called, is antibiotic-resistant bacteria that could infect and harm humans. Obviously, a remedy for this is to force farmers and ranchers to care for their livestock properly. If livestock owners are no longer allowed to use antibiotics subtherapeutically, then antibiotic use will be drastically reduced, and there will be less cause for concern about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This is easy enough to implement in developed countries like the US and Europe, where there are already many regulations on the use of antibiotics for growth. In fact, developed countries are already well on their way to ridding agriculture communities of this practice. However, subtherapeutic use is quickly becoming an issue in developing countries like China, Brazil, and India. Antibiotics use in livestock will increase as developing countries adopt more advanced practices. In these countries, antibiotics are beginning to be used with livestock as they used to be used in countries like the US and Europe. But how can we regulate livestock regulations in other countries? Short answer, we can't. The only thing we can do is focus on continuing to find ways to regulate antibiotic use in the US without banning it completely. In conclusion, use of antibiotics in meat production is a growing concern. A practice that began as a way to fight diseases in livestock populations has since become a way to keep animals at the weight needed for meat production without providing them with proper care. However, growing concerns about antibiotic-resistant bacteria that could be transferred to and harm humans means that subtherapeutic antibiotic practices are on their way out in developed countries. But because we cannot regulate developing countries' farming practices, all we can do is continue to find ways to better regulate our own, and hope that as many other countries develop, they will come to the same conclusion that we did. From myself, Benny, and David, thank you so much for listening.